I'm David Pollak. On behalf of my mother, Ruth, and all of my siblings and my family, welcome. We're here on this beautiful morning in this beautiful room to celebrate my father, Stephen Pollak.
Okay. I have the high honor of opening this memorial for Stephen John Pollak, our beloved grandfather, also known as Moppy. Today, we're going to hear amazing stories and reflections, accounts of the miraculous life that Stephen Pollak led. And many of us will also remember him as the light at the head of the table, gathering us around the dining room table. He was always curious, engaging, humble, kind, generous, and open-hearted. Steve was so well known for leading the conversation and drawing others out. But before the meal and the conversation, our family tradition was to have a moment of silence and to hold hands. That was our family tradition because we all crave true connection, especially in turbulent times. It also drew on the Quaker tradition and 2 generations of Pollak children worshiping in silence. In silence, we find our true selves and are able to come into pure presence. And that's what we ask all of you to do today. So, in the manner of friends and in honor of Stephen John Pollak, our beloved Moppy, who is the light of our lives, please join us in a moment of silence.
One of Moppy's 2 great-grandchildren. When I look at my watch, an old-fashioned watch that I wear on my wrist, not an Apple Watch or an iPhone, I often think of you now, Dad. There's a way that you lived your life, always aware that you were dancing with time. Not so much with pressure and uptightness, but with an attitude of seizing the day, bringing a joyful excitement to each special thing that you set your mind to do. And there was a sense of clockwork that you brought to your life, as well as to ours, to the days and the years ordered by your and Mom's vision of a life well lived. Evie, time to beep. This meant time to be up and get ready for school. Dad would call out as he made his way from his early morning exes or tennis game to his shower and suiting up for work. His daily exercise routine is, of course, famous. He was up at 6:15 every day, and he used an old-fashioned stopwatch that he hung around his neck on a long piece of rainbow yarn. When I was young, his exes, as he called them, were 22 minutes long, and he timed each section. For Dad, everything had its time and season. Sunday mornings were pancakes or waffles, with Dad manning the spatula. Every other weekend, we'd go to the country. Dad loved the seasonal activities of bringing home Stamen apples and making applesauce to freeze. In spring, we'd ski in Alta, and in summer, we'd go to Kitty Hawk. At Thanksgiving, we'd come together at their beautiful home on Newark Street with a big fire in the brick fireplace. We'd have a champagne toast. Dad always wore a festive, colorful dress shirt. He was a down to the minute kind of guy. When we drove to the beach, he'd revel in clocking the time. We left at 8:47, he'd say. We made good time. Like clockwork, even the vacation days at the beach began early with Dad putting up the bat wing, our shade structure, counting out the steps to get it up just right. For many years at Kitty Hawk, Dad raised the flag each day with my son, Cole. And we always had to be sure to get the paper. That is the Washington Post and the New York Times when we went for grocery. When we traveled within the US and abroad, Dad took pleasure in never adjusting the time on his watch. I think he always stayed connected to the comfort of his life back home, no matter where he might travel to. And especially towards the end of his life, Dad never wanted to nap. When Dr. Sheikh said it was important to rest, he did finally relent. One day, Dad was getting ready to take a nap and asked me to set up a favorite jazz tune on his iPhone as an alarm. And then he said, now set it to 18 minutes and leave the door open. He didn't want to miss out on life, not for a minute. A few days before Dad died, he Zoomed with Dr. Sheikh. He listened and took in the advice and kind words. And then he said, what's next? Letting go was next. And he did an amazing job of telling us all exactly how to do everything so that he could live as long as he possibly could. And then one day, he found his way with letting go of all that he held so dear. As I look at my watch, Dad, I have a new understanding of just how precious time is and a new level of conviction to make the most of it, just like you.
The poet, Hannah Senish, captured the essence of Steve's life. A bright light in this sometimes darkened world. There are stars up above so far away, we only see their light long, long after the star itself is gone. And so it is with the people we loved. Their memory keeps shining ever brightly, though their time with us is done. These are the lights that guide us. As we live our days, these are the ways we remember. We remember. Steve Pollak took on the challenge of guaranteeing the right to vote to all citizens and of providing access to justice for the most vulnerable in the District of Columbia. He was called to a series of great purposes, and he made such an impact over so many decades. Steve made a difference in our professional lives. We remember his integrity and his values, his energy and his work ethic, his deep commitment to the rule of law. Steve was our role model and our mentor. He loved what he was doing and made it a great experience for those of us who had the privilege to work with him, as I did in the Civil Rights Division and at Shea and Gardner. And he deeply touched each of our personal lives. We remember his sense of delight in each day. We remember his warm smile. He was gregarious and charming and a fun human being to be around, with a propensity for outrageous puns and not so funny jokes. Steve kept in close touch with his many friends from all phases of his life. We anticipated with pleasure the annual Pollak holiday letter, as both Steve and Ruth were excellent writers. They selected just the right photos from each year as they described their work and family adventures and commented on the state of our nation. I first knew Steve when I was very young. In June 1965, just after graduating from college, I came to work directly with John Doerr and with Steve as a research analyst in what was called the front office of the Civil Rights Division. John Doerr was the Assistant Attorney General and Steve was his deputy. I worked very closely with Steve on the comprehensive planning for implementation of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And then after the act passed on August 6th, on its immediate implementation. Prompt and fair enforcement of the new law was critical to voluntary compliance by officials in the southern states. And Steve played a major role in what was an almost flawless implementation of a complex and far-reaching law. In an oral history, Steve stated from an early age he wanted to be in government. He thought that government was a force for good and wanted to be a part of it. And after he left government, he continued public service, handling important civil rights education cases and devoting himself to numerous pro bono activities. As he described those opportunities, when people had something to be done for no pay, they often came to me to do it. I had no interest in saying no and generally said yes. I treated those unpaid activities as calling for the same kind of attention and energy as regular law work. Steve said that each such opportunity had been its own reward. Steve was an inspiring leader by example and by intellect. He knew how to delegate effectively and also how to keep full control of the projects and the people working with him. He was very confident of his judgments, but also consulted widely. He came to work early and he worked late, often very late, and so did we. Not because he demanded those long hours, but because he inspired us, and we did not want to disappoint him. Steve made our lives richer and more rewarding, and we were devoted to him. He treated his coworkers with respect and affection. He was generous in expressing his appreciation for our hard work. Steve was especially grateful to the support staff, whom he got to know well. Robin Biggins, Steve's dedicated assistant in his professional and personal life, supported him and now the extended Pollak family with great devotion, judgment, and competence for over 4 decades. Steve had enormous energy. He said that he always felt that a full plate is best. I think a more apt description would be overflowing. I recall one occasion when I stood in the doorway of his large corner office at Shea and Gardner overlooking DuPont Circle, watching the flurry of activity surrounding him, with phones ringing, associates and paralegals standing with documents in hand for his review or signature, Robin taking dictation, and a messenger waiting for a delivery to be ready. He looked up at me, and with a wide grin, he winked at me. As he would describe his professional life, he was in the midst, and he loved it. So many memories from over the years crowd in. After we moved to California, Ruth and Steve hosted us on our many trips to DC and their lovely house, which Ruth had searched diligently to find for the growing family. The warm home she created became a gathering place for the extended family and dear friends. We loved the walks that Ruth led in their Cleveland Park neighborhood and hearing about her rewarding career as an accomplished film producer. My husband, Brian, and I had the great pleasure of traveling with Ruth and Steve to Alaska, the Galapagos, Turkey, bicycling in the Netherlands and Belgium, hiking in Yosemite, and enjoying their beloved cabin in rural Virginia and the beach in Kitty Hawk. Wherever we went, Steve had an unerring ability to fetter out our daily ice cream, and he loved the opportunity to drive a rented car in distant places. Steve handled the adoption of our son, and he served on the board of visitors of McGeorge School of Law, where both Brian and I taught for many years. He gave us, our extended family, and so many others, the gift of friendship. I want to end as I began with the words of the poet. Although Steve's time with us is done, his light inspires and guides us. We feel his presence. May our cherished memories of his life be a blessing.
Good morning. In reflecting upon my father's death, this immense loss, I keep coming back to one particular quality of his that I've always deeply admired, his humility. My dad was a deeply humble man, and that humility was one of his superpowers. As many of you know, it didn't mean he didn't have strong opinions, because he did. And he shared those opinions even when they ran against the grain. And it didn't mean that he shrunk from a fight, because he absolutely didn't. He leaned into change based on his deep commitment to fairness and justice and his enormous capacity for hard work. But he never made it about him, his ego, his gratification. He kept his eyes on getting things done. As we're hearing today and yesterday at the absolutely overwhelming event at the Justice Department honoring him, he got an incredible amount done. Looking back, I see his humility expressed in so many touching parts of who he was and how he conducted himself. One way his humility showed itself was that in this city of perks and privileges connected to high office and power, he never took anything. For example, he waited for years in line with everyone else to get Redskins tickets, and then faithfully attended games with his dear friend Jim Heller in pretty much the worst seats in the stadium. And when, as a kid, we went to see the woeful Senators, it was always in the nosebleed $5 seats. Nothing fancy. He bought inexpensive cars, he drove them forever, and to his dying day, refused to use valet parking, no matter how long the search for a parking spot or the walk to the destination. His humility showed up in his offbeat sense of humor. It was not a sharp wit, and it did not come at anyone's expense. It was joyful silliness, like when he would walk around the house and spontaneously break into song, like mentholatum, 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 deep heating rub. Or when he would grant one of his coveted Herb Meshmer awards for something that one of us had done. It may sound obscure, it was. A made-up person, a made-up award, but always at the ready to recognize something that someone had done. And profoundly, he did not talk about himself, which in some ways was a loss for us. It wasn't until the later years of his life, as we started to probe more deeply about his life work, that we wrenched out of him the amazing stories of his work in the Civil Rights Division, the White House, and in access to justice in the District of Columbia and nationally. And he was incredibly generous with his time to young lawyers in pro bono service, the Historical Society of the DC Circuit. When the DC Bar sent out notice of his passing, more than 36 former DC Bar presidents and members of the Board of Governors took time to write back about what they admired about him. And so many of these messages emphasized his generosity, his kindness, his gentleness, not a word often used with a high-powered Washington lawyer, I might add, and how he was never too busy to offer advice and counsel. And most importantly for me, one of his beloved children, he brought humility to his parents. What did that look like? Well, he didn't make my life into something about him. He didn't need me to validate him. He was comfortable with me being me. He valued that, and he was supportive, but not directive. If he had judgments, he kept them to himself. He didn't push me in one direction or another, but he was there, curious and helpful. And as the son who became a lawyer and a Washington lawyer, I followed a winding path through some of the same places he'd gone, but to a different destination. Like Dad, I went to Dartmouth, but I left after 2 years and finished at Berkeley. I tried what he did and found it wasn't me, and he never pushed, not once, for me to stay or express disappointment in my decision. And then I ended up in New Haven, where I moved after Berkeley to be with Whitney, my partner of 43 years now. And after a couple of years, I went to business school at Yale. He never once said, "You should go to law school." And when I went to law school, After my first year of business school, he was supportive, but he maintained a respectful distance, allowing me space to find my way. And truth be told, I loved business school, and I thought law school was meh. And then I ended up practicing law in DC these past 3 decades at Bredoff and Kaiser, serving as a business and transactional lawyer for the labor movement, never setting foot inside a federal courthouse after my first 2 years. But never once did he try to push me in a different direction. He always listened, asked questions, and was supportive. He let me find me, and that was a beautiful thing. Dad's humility, matched with his brilliant mind, his deep commitment to justice, his rigor and practicality, and his amazing judgment, all combined to make him the amazing man that he was. He remains a model for my life, and I love him dearly, and I miss him deeply.
My name is Lisa Brown, and I got to know Steve when I joined Shane Gardner as a baby lawyer. And this was after his storied time at the Department of Justice and in the White House. But he brought the exact same values, passion, and work ethic to his private practice. I know I'm only one of many in this room who benefited from Steve's mentorship and whose career was shaped and influenced by Steve. Steve was a mentor, as you're hearing, as a lawyer, but also as a person. As anyone who ever worked with Steve knew, Steve believed in the power of the law, but he knew that it took hard work, effective advocacy, and perseverance by lawyers to make sure that the law achieved just ends. No one was more diligent about his work than Steve. He was a workhorse. Even as a senior partner, he would review draft briefs and deposition outlines line by line with junior associates. No detail was too small for Steve. Long before becoming managing partner of the firm, John Aldock worked with Steve when John was a new associate at the firm. And he said that his first brief with Steve came back with edits on every single line, including the certificate of service. He then took it to another longtime colleague of Steve's and said, Steve must have hated this. And John Rich said, to the contrary, if there weren't entire arguments crossed out or added, he actually liked it a lot. Wendy White, who is another longtime colleague of Steve's, reminded me that there was a list of what to know and do if you worked with Steve when you were at Shane Gardner. One of which was when stapling a brief, we did used to do that, the staple must be at an angle so that when read the brief, the pages would not rip. And we on the team debated whether the best copy should go to the court or to Steve. We learned the craft of lawyering, and that included not only excellent fact-finding, strategy, oral advocacy, but also effective interaction with clients, opposing counsel, and judges. While Steve edited heavily and insisted on careful preparation, his mentorship in the art of lawyering was much more subtle. He showed us by example how to treat everyone with respect, integrity, and thoughtfulness, values he embodied every day. I believe it was my very first assignment at Shane Gardner to work with Steve representing the United Mine Workers Health and Retirement Funds. This took us to Bluefield, West Virginia, a small coal town in a narrow set of mountains. We interviewed coal miners in the school gym about their medical issues and healthcare. And Steve treated them with the exact same respect and took them just as seriously as his fancy, serious clients, which led them to open up and trust us. Steve's integrity made him a particularly effective special master and arbitrator. His ego never drove the conversation, and he was able to navigate considerable egos among the other lawyers by calmly, persistently, and diligently focusing on the merits in order to successfully settle cases. Steve was Central Casting's image of an old school honorable lawyer, an ardent advocate who acted with humility, humanity, and integrity. This led to him having unparalleled credibility with, well, everyone. Steve also modeled a commitment to public service and giving back to his community, always finding time, as you're hearing, to fit in one more pro bono matter. This is actually what brought me to Shane Gardner. I chose the firm in part because of its strong commitment to pro bono work. And thanks to Steve and his long-time relationship with the Lawyers Committee, I had a steady docket of cases to enforce the Fair Housing Act and served as special master in litigation against Denny's for discriminating against customers. Pro bono work was part of Steve's DNA, and he was instrumental in building the firm's commitment to it. And it was in no small part thanks to Steve that I subsequently entered public service myself, following in his footsteps to DOJ and the White House. He showed us what a life in public service in and out of government could look like, opening our eyes to that possibility for ourselves. It was always, as you've heard, it was always about the issue at hand and never about Steve. What I didn't know until talking to David recently about his father was that Steve very consciously didn't do interviews when he was working in the public eye because he thought he could get more accomplished if he worked behind the scenes and let others take credit. And I didn't even realize that I had absorbed this as I entered public service and realized that my own instinct, thanks to Steve, was to push others forward while I strategized and wrote the talking points. And it sounds very old-fashioned now, but it was a wonderful lesson. Steve's values shaped his interactions in every way. As I spoke to former colleagues at Shane Gardner, to a person, they remarked on how supportive he was of staff and associates. He was an early advocate at the firm for hiring women and mentored many of us. He treated everyone at the firm with respect, whether you were the managing partner or worked in the mailroom. Steve cared deeply about the firm and its people. Even when under pressure, Steve would ask you about your child by name and their ball game or their cold or something else that was going on in your life before turning to the very pressing legal issue in front of him. Steve never lost his humanity. It was Steve who suggested that we take our tennis rackets with us on a business trip to Birmingham, Alabama. And Steve who brought jam made with berries that he and Ruth grew out in Rappahannock. And Steve who invited us to have dinner with Ruth and him when we were skiing at Alta, always wanting to know what I was doing and what my young son was interested in. Steve was the same person in every aspect of his life. Steve and I were in the 6:50 a.m. early bird St. Albans tennis group. They're ready to play the minute that the courts opened. And he was the same person on the tennis court as he was in the judicial court. Patient, steady, talented, creative, competitive, determined, and honest. And I lost him more than once because I wanted to hit hard and go for the winner. Steve was a mensch, and I hope I honor him by living forward his legacy of service, justice, and human decency, not to mention skiing at Alta at age 90.
We are the cousins who are the grandchildren, and we're gonna each say like one thing, less than 1 minute, starting in the youngest. Rosie, you ready? Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ah. I think we should line up in order.
I think we should go forward. Yeah. Wait, hold my phone from me. I'm Rosie. I'm the youngest of all of these brothers and cousins. I'm gonna be going over to the house around the corner and spending time with Grandpa and playing with him in the basement. and that made me feel super loved. And he made me feel super special. When I was born, I remember that he was there, smiling and praising me. I miss him a lot, and I loved him so much. He was the best. I love you, Grandpa, and I'm sending up prayers to you.
When I was a child, Steve and I would go out every morning in Kitty Hawk and raise the flag. He showed me how to properly mount the flag, and at night he showed me how to fold it back up. It was challenging for me to fold it up myself because at the time the flag was longer than I was. But I loved it. It was this wonderful tradition. When I became a teenager, though, I started listening to the news, and the whole thing started to seem a little bit obscene to me because I could only see what was wrong with this country. So I didn't particularly want to do it anymore. I still did it, but. And now what was wonderful about Steve was that he wasn't a blind idealist. He looked at the country and he saw the problems, but he said, what am I going to do about it? And he went out there and did it. And he could see how far the country had come. And that's why he loved his country so much. And what I'm appreciating now is that he loved America and wanted to share that with me. And so now, and I dedicate this question to him, I'm asking, what am I going to do about it?
As we've heard, Mapi and Bami have this wonderful house in the country, which all of us grew up going to, with just us and them on the weekends. We would drive out to Rappahannock County in Virginia, shop for the weekend at the local Food Lion, and spend weekends picking berries, playing board games, doing projects around the house, and getting to know the various farm animals that roamed around the property. No matter what was happening at home or at school or in our lives, we would always have these magical weekends in the country where we got to go adventuring with Mapi and Bami. These memories of the country house feel representative of the special way that Mapi and Bami create space for their kids and their grandkids to share in the places and the activities that they loved, always making us feel like a friend as well as a grandchild.
I remember so vividly throughout my life watching Moppy complete his morning exercise routine. I've always deeply admired his ability to commit and follow through so steadfastly to that and every routine, and that commitment gave our family so much. My childhood was measured in 4 identical beats every year without fail: skiing in Alta, fishing in Eagle River, beaching in Kitty Hawk, and Thanksgiving in DC. These beats were a gift from my grandparents, and the gift of that routine was a deep connection to my family, extended family, and these places. And I appreciate so much that gift and model of how to be a family.
My memory of Steve is sitting at the dinner table, Moppy sitting at the dinner table. Like the others have said, it was a beat, Thanksgiving, Passover, Kitty Hawk, Alta. The thing that connected it all was all of us gathered around a big table with Moppy just sitting there at the head. And he wasn't filling space. Instead, he was asking questions, said, what are we grateful for? Can we go around in a circle, share? And I have this vivid memory of just him looking out over us and just being in it and celebrating it, not with filling the space, but with creating it.
This is for my older brother, who's the next in the progression upwards to the eldest. Yep, he's right there. Noah says, I'm going to miss the chance to learn from my grandfather. He was not a loud man or one prone to speaking of his accomplishments. But if you asked him a question, he would always take the time to answer it, and something interesting might slip out. Wisdom, memories, anecdotes from his career, suddenly you would learn something fascinating. He would tell a story so well that you would feel like you were there. He loved to talk about swimming with my new wife, about swimming at Dartmouth, and his law school swim team, the Remainder Men, He still remembered all of his times. With me, it's hard to pick one story, a cliche, I know. But he talked to me a couple of years ago about helping draft the Americans with Disabilities Act, something that has changed my life. And I had no idea until that moment what role he played. Thank you for that. Thank you for always answering my questions and for taking me seriously. Thank you for tirelessly, quietly working to make the world a better place. You are an inspiration to me. You will be missed.
I have a distinct memory of Moppy, my grandfather, standing on the beach in Kitty Hawk, just watching us in the ocean. I don't know if this was something that he picked up in the Navy or if it was just his anxiety. But whenever there was anyone in the water, he was there watching, making sure that everyone was going to be all right, taking care of them. And I think this, in some small way, captures his incredible mix of love and care for us, a little bit of anxiety to make sure we were all safe, but also just watching over us, making sure we were all okay, and supporting our whole family.
I'm Andrea. That was my daughter who had her own interpretation of the moment of silence. So apologies. I found myself with this short assignment, thinking about carrot cake. And Moppy could be a intimidating person, as you can imagine. And I was a loud, uncombed child. But I remember when he would make carrot cake, which was something I probably witnessed 3 or 4 times in my life. And as the carrot cake lay cooling, waiting the appropriate amount of time before it was frosted, you could tell that he was excited and that he was able to revel in something as small and as delightful as carrot cake. And of course, it was perfect every time.
He's got it. We're good. Much of my life experience is anchored in place, reinforced through metronomic return. I stand here in a room that was the gymnasium of my childhood school. The backboard would have hung right about here, and the basketball floor was 10 feet down. And I slept last night a few blocks away in the house where I grew up. I've always associated this attachment to place and to return with my dad. For a long time, I ascribed it to him being a boring guy, lacking in imagination and satisfied to just keep doing the things he'd always done. His favorite ice cream was butter pecan. I couldn't understand that. He traveled the world for sure, and I guess would very occasionally have a scoop of mint chip. But he most loved to return again and again and again to the same few places of deep resonance and connection. As young parents, Steve's mom and dad, Laura and Maury, previous slide, please. I have the clicker, actually. I have the power. As young parents, Steve's mom and dad, Laura and Maury, found a summer getaway on Cranberry Lake in Eagle River, Wisconsin. They rented and later bought a tiny cottage from the Grady's, who owned the small vacation house next door. Steve and his sister Louise, and if you can pick out Steve, he's oh, no, but hang on. I can run the slides from now. Thanks. Here's Steve, and here's his sister Louise, who's here with us today. And those are the Grady kids from next door. So they'd play together. In the early 60s, when grandchildren like me came along, they built a slightly bigger house to go along with it. I and all my cousins would sleep in the little house. This is the roof of the little house, on the screen porch in the wind and the pines. It's a place of wildlife and tranquility, of water and food and family. And they would return year after year, and every so often the cycle would refresh. Laura teaching her baby to swim, Steve teaching me and my brother, his babies, to love the water. Steve leading the Little Rascals out in the motorboat in 1935. So that's Steve at the motor there in the foreground, and his sister Louise over his right shoulder, and the other kids from Circle Drive. And again, 2 generations later, doing the exact same thing with his grandkids. And sometimes, maybe every 60 years or so, there was a muskie. And again, that's Steve on the one edge and Louise on the other, and maybe one of the Grady kids in the middle. My mom and dad, Ruth and Steve, discovered the Outer Banks of North Carolina as newlyweds, following his ship up and down the coast and living in 16 rent-by-the-week flats in Navy towns like Yorktown, clearly having a blast. And then bringing the family to visit, that's Louise and his parents clamming in Yorktown. In 1959, they settled into their own summer getaway, packing up the station wagon to spend a week with the kids in a 1-story cinder block cottage in Southern Shores. The Outer Banks was a desert then, only a few small houses in this new community of Southern Shores, and the nearest supermarket tens of miles away up the road back on the mainland. The years passed. The family grew. We played tennis. Each of us 4 kids every year brought a friend to the beach with us. Grandchildren arrived. And grew. So you just heard from Cole about raising the flag. This is only 2 of those pictures every year. A place of togetherness, and always the sea, punctuated occasionally by a hurricane and a fish. Dad discovered Alta, Utah in 1973, coaxed there by our neighbor and friend, Bob Stern, who had trained there with the 10th Mountain Division during World War II. We loved it. Dad was an incredible skier, steadied by the live forever turn that his friend Gene Christiansen taught him. And that's Gene in the green parka. And Dad's live forever parka. that he finally retired, I think after this 2017 season. Alta's a place for family, fun, food, and snow. And that picture of Dad and Sandro in 2017, it snowed 6 inches in 55 minutes while we were out on the slopes. In 1964, Ruth and Steve bought a patch of land in Rappahannock County, Virginia, about 70 miles west of here. His parents visited to check it out. We called it the Up and Down Country because it was on the side of a mountain up against the Shenandoah National Park. Everyone went right to work. Last year, I asked Dad what moved him to buy the place and to get out there with Mom every other weekend for 50 years. And he said it was the only way he could stop working. So I guess there's work and then there's work. A joyful place of restorative business, sometimes filled with children and grandchildren, often a quiet time of togetherness for just the two of them, Ruth and Steve. And wild berries for picking and eating and canning and freezing and waffles and pies. Well, my understanding has evolved. If somewhat slowly, unlike my daughter, Rebecca, who you just heard from, who figured it out without thinking about it and summarized it in just a few sentences. Dad loved these places. They calmed him and centered him and nourished his soul. But his true connection was not to these places, but through them and to the people he loved. The meaning, the true connection was to family and friends and the shared experience of being in the world together. And I'll leave you with these 3 haiku I wrote for his 90th birthday about muskie fishing, which you can read to yourselves.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Bill Schultz. I met Steve Pollak at a lunch arranged by Judge William Bryant. It was after the 2000 election. I was leaving government and had asked Judge Bryant for advice. He was advising that I go into private practice, and when I was resistant, he suggested I have lunch with Steve Pollak. I think Judge Bryant thought that this was someone who had successfully combined government service and private practice, and someone whom I would admire. Judge Bryant was right. I later learned that everybody in the Washington legal community admired Steve Pollak, adored him, and loved him. This is why he was hired by Geraldine Ferraro when she was running for vice president, President Carter's brother, Billy, his chief of staff, Hamilton Jordan, his press secretary, Jody Powell. They all hoped that Steve's outstanding reputation would rub off on them. Steve's accomplishments were extraordinary, but there's one item on his personal biography that's not usually mentioned, and it caught my attention. Steve was an Eagle Scout. Of course he was an Eagle Scout. He rose to the top of every endeavor that he joined. But Eagle Scout doesn't just describe an award in this case. It describes who Steve was. Those of you who are Boy Scouts know the Boy Scout values that you have to learn. A Boy Scout is trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, and so on. Well, Steve lived by these values. And here are 4 core values that were Steve's best values. First, and you've heard this, it was never about Steve. After talking to you about what he was up to, he always turned the conversation to what you were up to. How is your family? How's work? How are you doing? And I think Whitney mentioned this, but he was a master at leading the conversation at dinner. He would always make sure that everybody at the table talked about something interesting they were doing. And he was unfailingly receptive to everybody's point of view. Second, Steve did the work. He did it himself. There was no limit to how hard he worked, and he left no stone unturned. And the results were astounding. As Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, he didn't just run the division, he tried cases. He tried cases in the South, and then he argued a very important voting rights case in the United States Supreme Court. I saw this work ethic at the DC Circuit Historical Society, which Steve led for 30 years. Through his absolute persistence, every year he funded the organization by calling the leaders of the DC bar and getting them and their law firms to contribute to the society. He created a series of programs about famous cases from the DC Circuit. And at the planning meetings for these programs, Steve was always the best prepared. He was always the one that had read all the cases. And when it came to reviewing the accounting statements, Steve read them with care, made corrections, and improved them. President Lyndon Johnson recognized Steve's hard work, talent, and loyalty. When Steve was nominated to the position of Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights in September of 1967, he was invited to a lunch at the LBJ Ranch with President Johnson, Attorney General Ramsey Clark, and others. And at the lunch, the president told Steve how proud he was of him for having successfully steered the Washington, D.C. Reorganization Act through Congress. This was what led to home rule in Washington, D.C. The president said it was a magnificent job and that the people of the United States and the nation itself owed Steve a real debt of gratitude. The president also said that Steve had exceeded his expectations. And here's the best part. And then it was rare that anybody exceeded the president's expectations. And in fact, that he found that people generally did less than he expected. Later, Ramsey Clark told Steve that it was rare that the president thought someone exceeded his expectations, and even rarer that he told them so. I don't think anyone has counted the number of organizations that Steve contributed to, but what was remarkable to me is that in every case, he ended up as a leader. Captain of the Dartmouth swimming team, president of the DC Bar, chair of the Washington Lawyers Committee, so on and so on and so on. In a 1967 article in the Washington Post, Ruth Pollak described Steve as follows. He can do anything he takes on. He's a pretty able fellow. As usual, Ruth was right on target, although a bit understated, I think. Third, Steve changed with the times. At his 80th birthday dinner, Ruth told a story of when she informed Steve that after raising 4 children, she had decided to go to work and to take a job outside the home. And Steve's reaction was, that wasn't the deal I signed up for. But the next day, he came back and he said, I completely support this. And Ruth said at the dinner, and every day after that, he was completely supportive of her new career. Speaking of Ruth, the 1967 Post article I referred to has a picture of Ruth playing the guitar and describes her as follows. Ruth Pollak is a slim, brown-haired, brown-eyed woman with a friendly, no humbug air and a burbling curiosity about life, people, and ideas. True in 1967 and true today. Fourth, Steve never deviated from his principles. He was the same at the end of his life as he was when he was younger, completely committed to civil rights every step along the way. He may have slowed down physically a bit, but he never slowed down mentally. And it was a long, fulfilling, wonderful life.
Hello. Hi. In March of 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, my father moved his work home from the office. Luckily, he was handed a laptop on his way out of Goodwin Law. He set up his office at the dining room table and worked there pretty much until the beginning of 2024. After he died, I noticed that he had on the table 2 plates that I made for him when I was little, ceramic plates. And in one of the plates, I found a ring and a tie clip. And they both had his father's monogram. So all that time, you know, and in his office and then bringing home the things from his office, he had the plates that I made him, and he had his father's most intimate things. In his remarks, I'm using a lot of my father's words in this talk. In his remarks at his father's memorial in 1978, my dad said, "We have come together to celebrate my dad, his long and full life, and the richness of the gifts he has left us. I miss his presence terribly. We all do. But mixed with the sadness of losing him is an intense joy. The joy with which he lived and loved his family, his friends, and his work." My father loved to work. He worked a lot. I recall being at the beach in Kitty Hawk, Southern Shores, for a number of years in the 1960s before we had a telephone in the cottage. And my father spent quite a good part of the vacation days standing in a glassed-in phone booth that was in the middle of a little traffic island of grass on the way at the turnoff for the beach road about a quarter mile from the house. So, you know, we could see him if we went to the market, we passed by. In the time since my father's death, reading the tributes posted about him by different organizations that he worked with, a clearer picture has emerged for me about his work. And what's come into focus is how much of this work was service. And so as a value, service, it's helped me understand the role of service in my own life and the meaning of it, and has helped help me understand meaning for myself in relation to quite a lot of service that I do, but I didn't really put it together because unlike my brothers, Roger especially, I didn't work alongside my father and share too many obvious things with him, being in different profession and so on. In 2005, at his mother's memorial, my father spoke about how, quote, by action and word, she made public service a part of her life and challenged those around her to do the same. In her quiet way, she became a leader of each organization she served. She got to the nut of an issue and made things happen. She was an inspiration to me. From my earliest years, I aspired to public service, and she was my model. Now, when I asked my grandma Laura if she'd ever had a job, she said no, she never had a job because it was volunteer. But she led the League of Women Voters in Illinois and so on. And so this values my father inhered from his mother. I also think he took to heart deeply John F. Kennedy's exhortation, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. As well as the beautiful tributes posted online, we did receive letters, individual letters from people. And one letter was from Phoebe Jones, who's here today, daughter of friend of my parents and childhood friend of mine. She wrote, I'll never forget the time Steve and a colleague came all the way to Philadelphia from DC to see if he could convince women farmers we were working with to stay a class action suit. He came to our women's center, which was at the time a hole in the wall. He commented on how impressive it was and how much he liked it. I appreciated that, especially as we had been in his office, which was truly impressive and bespoke power. When I visited my father during his first hospitalization at the end of 2021, he was wearing a hat. Oh, I forgot to bring it up. And I asked him about it. And he said, oh, it's the most wonderful organization. You know, it's really a great not-for-profit. And he told me what a wonderful trip he'd had with Mom and with Dorothy and Brian going to Alaska with the boat company. And then and he talked about some other trips they'd taken. And then he talked about loss and talked about loss and about not being able to go on boat trips anymore or bike trips anymore, play tennis anymore. But then he said, I loved it all. I loved it all. In his 2006 family newsletter, he wrote, Ruth indulged my bliss at our Blue Ridge cabin on many weekends with hours on our bicycles. She indulged my bliss. So beautiful. At Thanksgiving in 2022, my father talked to us about life as being in two spheres. And he was talking to us, to each of us, to each of the grandchildren, helping them, trying to help them understand their lives from something he experienced. Two spheres. One is family and one is beyond family. Life according to Steve Pollak. I think sometimes he struggled with the relationship between these two spheres, including especially during the 2.5 year period of his illness with cardiac amyloides as his heart started pumping less and less, even though the rest of him was super healthy because of all those exercises. And his doctor said he had the arteries of a 30-year-old. After his, that perhaps he really derived a greater sense of his identity from his service. And even at that point, a lot of his work and service was service for the family too. You know, I mean, he didn't leave a mess for sure. After his first hospitalization, he carried with him a great deal of anxiety, which maybe he'd had all his life, but been able to successfully mask. And sometimes he only wanted to talk with us with a list in his hand of things that needed to get done. One day on the phone, I was trying to calm him. I said, "Dad, I love you." He said, "Yes, but we know all that." In August, half a year later, of 2022, after a second hospitalization, really scary one, we were able miraculously to go back to the beach at Kitty Hawk. None of us, including my dad, had thought it would happen. We filled 2 houses with 3 generations of family, of joyful family. During that trip and after, my father allowed himself to be more vulnerable sometimes. And as we walked on the beach, he turned to me and said, quote, "It must have been hard to be displaced 3 times." I don't know if you know, I'm the oldest of 4. And so he was tuning into me after all that time. But he was always tuned in. He was always tuned in. He just didn't maybe say it. So he said that. And as Sandra and I were leaving the beach and going to our car, my father came down from the porch to the car and hugged me. And I said, "I love you, Dad." And he said, "I love you, Linda." Last summer at the beach, we got to go twice after he got sick. We were both reading Robert Caro's Working, in which he reflects on writing the LBJ books, which my dad read, and he would have liked to get to the 5th, but wasn't out yet. And The Power Broker about Robert Moses, which I had read pretty recently, and our worlds touched. And I read about, in Working, I was reading about the LBJs, and he was reading about Robert Moses and the great planner, you know, both, and of course about power, both, and was nice to be. My father was a big reader and inspired a lot of things that I read. In the final months of his life, my father sustained many more losses, one by one, in quick succession. I feel fortunate to have been able to live some of those alongside him with my mother and my siblings and spouses and family. A last walk in the neighborhood, last time making waffles on a Sunday morning, the last day of filling the bird feeder. He was really Mr. Use it till you use it or lose it, you know, he said. He didn't want to stop taking out the trash. Even though there was someone to do it, Irene was helping do it, other people were helping do it, he didn't want to stop. Then he didn't come down for breakfast, then he didn't get out of bed. But that was only 4 days before he died. So he did it all with grace. With each loss, with his acceptance of each loss came somehow a renewal of appreciation of some smaller, maybe less noticed aspect of life. And to the last, he was so happy to see family and friends, to hear people talk about their work. I think Rachel, remember, that's what he was ready to hear about, excited. 3 days before he died, he wanted, yeah, Alex's trip, what happened, right? He did it all with grace, and to the end, he did his best, because that's what he always did. He did his best, and he did his best dying with grace. So I'm ending by paraphrasing another of my father's remarks at his mother's memorial and substituting him. I will remember my dad as he was to the very end, beautiful and as a presence. His life speaks to each of us. He says, make the most of what you have and give something back. I invite each of you to close your eyes and remember my father's smile.
Here.
Ruth, my dear, these words are especially for you. How can one possibly capture in just a few minutes the extraordinary life of Stephen Pollak? The truth is that it's impossible, but I'll try. I'll begin on March 17, 1965, the day 37-year-old Steve joined the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, and that very night flew on an Air Force jet to Selma, Alabama. There, civil rights lawyers had been beaten and tear gassed while crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The images from that bloody Sunday were shocking the conscience of the nation. The marchers, protected by an order issued by the great Judge Frank Johnson, were able to continue on to Montgomery. Steve was there, sometimes along Route 80, sometimes in Montgomery, working with local police, coordinating with the federalized National Guard, and ensuring that the court order was obeyed. Steve was there when the marchers arrived at the state capitol and heard Dr. Martin Luther King declare, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Not long after, Steve was on Capitol Hill, negotiating with senators and helping draft the Mansfield-Dirksen Compromise that became the Voting Rights Act of 1965, perhaps the most important civil rights law ever passed. Then, when the effectiveness of that law was threatened by narrow lower court interpretations, Steve, by then Assistant Attorney General, argued the case in the Supreme Court of the United States, Allen against State Board of Elections. Steve faced withering questions from Justice Hugo Black, reacting to Steve's reminder that it was the Supreme Court in South Carolina versus Katzenbach which had sustained Congress's suspension of newly enacted voting laws across the South. The justice interrupted. "Any way it's applied? You don't really think that, do you?" "Of course not," responded Steve, holding firm that Section 5's basic principle that the suspension of voting laws until the Attorney General was satisfied that they weren't discriminatory had in fact been validated in Katzenbach. Justice Black again interrupted. "The Attorney General? A prosecutorial officer who's not a federal judge?" Undaunted, Steve responded coolly. It was not the Attorney General who suspended the law, but Congress acting pursuant to its authority under the 15th Amendment. Steve won, with the court squarely holding in a broad and sweeping opinion that Section 5 was aimed at discriminatory laws, subtle as well as obvious, and applied to all of them, no matter how small. Justice Black dissented. Robert Caro, in the latest volume of his Johnson biography, said this: "It was Abraham Lincoln who struck off the chains of Black Americans, but it was Lyndon Johnson who led them into voting booths and made them at last and forever a true part of American political life." How much apart, Caro asks? 43 years later, a mere blink of history's eyes, a Black American was elected president of the United States. Steve Pollak played a critical role in that remarkable period of American history, drafting the Voting Rights Act, overseeing its initial enforcement, and defending it in the Supreme Court of the United States. This ought to have been enough, more than enough for any life, but not for Steve Pollak. He was just getting started. And if I had more time, I'd describe Steve's work as counsel for the National Education Association in the 1960s and 70s, when he won federal court orders in Mississippi and Alabama, striking down racially discriminatory teacher hiring exams. It was because of my interest in those cases that I, then a young lawyer in Chicago, seeking advice on how to handle my first civil rights case, first met Steve Pollak. We had lunch at Loeb's Delicatessen on 15th Street, the first of many meals Steve and I shared there over the years. So many lawyers from Steve's firm ate there so often that they offered a hot dog with Swiss and onions called the Shea and Gardner. I could also talk about Griffin against Breckinridge, one of the 15 cases Steve argued in the Supreme Court, where the court agreed with Steve that Section 1985, the Ku Klux Klan Act, should be accorded a sweep as broad as its language, meaning that the statute, as Steve had argued, prohibited not just conspiracies by public officials, but also by private parties as well. The decision was unanimous, this time including Justice Black. I could also talk about Steve's service as President Johnson's advisor for the District of Columbia, where he worked on the legislation that replaced the old city commissioner system and led to the appointment of the city's first Black mayor. I could talk about Steve's leadership of the Civil Rights Division and his decades of devotion to the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law. He co-chaired both the Washington and national committees. The National Committee Board met in New York, and Steve and I would often catch the Eastern shuttle in the morning. For a short time, it was the Trump shuttle, and return later in the day. I cherished those flights. No phones, no interruptions, just long conversations about politics, books, and family. I could talk about Steve's leadership of my court's historical society and its mediation program. Steve revered the federal courts. Whenever he was in the courthouse, which was often, he insisted on calling me judge. Even when we were alone in chambers, I just couldn't get him to stop. And finally, I could talk about what Edie and I discovered during the many wonderful dinners we shared with Ruth and Steve at our weekend homes in Rappahannock County. That Steve made a superb dinner salad and actually knew how to fish. He once claimed to have caught and released in our pond a 16-inch bass. Now, I believe virtually everything my dear friend Steve Pollak told me, but not that. Steve Pollak was the last of that great generation of lawyers, like Burke Marshall and John Doerr, like Pat Wald, Lou Oberdorfer, John Douglas, and John Nolan, who served their government and believed in their bones that every lawyer has an obligation to represent the unrepresented, to be a citizen lawyer and lawyer statesman, and that access to the courts for all, no matter one's race or wealth, is the mainstay of the rule of law. In saying this, I speak for a grateful generation of younger lawyers, including this one, whose careers and commitment to public service were inspired by Steve Pollak. Justice Hugo Black, yes, the same Justice Black who dissented, once said, "The very first condition of lasting happiness is that a life should be full of purpose, aiming at something outside self." That was just the kind of life Steve lived. And his shining example reminds us every day to live with purpose outside ourselves. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name's Matt Fruman. I am the council member that represents this area and including representing Ruth and Steve and Whitney and Roger. I'm here in my official capacity to present a resolution that the council did and also representing Mayor Bowser, who's done a special letter in for this occasion. But I have known Steve for close on 35 years. My wife Lena and I raised our once young family in parallel with Whitney and Roger and their family, and we basked in the warmth that Ruth and Steve gave to all of us. There's been a lot of talk about how Steve was a great mentor to young lawyers. I felt that it may be hard to picture me. It's increasingly hard to picture me as a young lawyer, but I was. And Steve would always ask about the matters that I worked on and would encourage me in different ways and give support. And it really was something wonderful. And I didn't know a ton about the work that Steve did as we first got to know each other. At some point, I said to my brother-in-law, who's a lawyer in Pittsburgh, that I had, that we were friends with Roger and Whitney, and Steve Pollak was a lawyer who'd been active in lots of things. And my brother-in-law said, "Oh my God, he is the best lawyer I have ever seen." They had been in a matter against each other. I think Steve may have represented a union and my brother-in-law represented a major business in Pennsylvania. And they had worked on opposite sides of a matter, but had built up such strong respect for each other. And Tom's confidence in Steve's ability as a lawyer was so striking. But he also said that as great a lawyer as he was also really great to work with to make sure that they got to a good result. And when somebody who's on the other side shines that kind of admiration on you, that is very, very meaningful. I would try to ask Steve about things that he did. Lots of people who've spoken have talked about how he focused on you, and it was hard to get things out of him. But I remember in particular a story he told about the district achieving home rule and working with President Johnson, and something urgently had happened, something changed at the last minute, and he needed to go and wait on the driveway of John Heckinger's house for him to come back from the theater to say, President Johnson needs you to play this role tomorrow for the district to achieve home rule. And John Heckinger, I don't think really wanted to do it, but I think Steve had Johnson's touch in that moment and made it be a thing that happened. It was wonderful to hear the words about all of the different things that Steve accomplished in his professional career and on behalf of the residents of the District of Columbia and on matters of civil rights. It's great that all of that happened because it spares all of you to have me read this entire thing. This is the resolution that the council passed to honor Steve's life. And I'll just read the closing of it. I'm not a young lawyer anymore, so I need my glasses. The Council of the District of Columbia recognizes, honors, and celebrates Stephen J. Pollak for his lifelong commitment to public service, championing of civil rights, and service as a powerful beacon to generations of younger attorneys. And then, please don't tell my colleagues, but I'm gonna give the mayor the last word. So this from the letter that Mayor Bowser has sent. In addition to, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but in addition to his work on the Voting Rights Act, Steve was also instrumental in enforcing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, drafting the Fair Housing Act of 1968. This work extended to achieving home rule for Washington, D.C., an incredibly significant milestone in our city's history and one I cherish as mayor. The mayor goes on to talk about Steve's work in the Washington legal community that you've all heard about all day, a pillar in establishing, embedding the principles of pro bono service in the Washington bar, making giant differences in the lives of people here in the district and across the country, and in the lives of the lawyers who benefited from doing that work and having a sense of purpose. The mayor goes on to say, the true story of Washington, D.C. cannot be told properly without acknowledging the many extraordinary contributions of Steve Pollak. His legacy is one of profound impact and unwavering commitment to justice and equality that will ignite inspiration in generations to come. I stand with 700,000 residents of Washington, D.C. in honoring Steve's memory and celebrating a life so very well lived.